it's Mrs. Ross. I'm going to read Mr. Happy by Roger Hargreaves. And this is a book that I read when I was a little girl, and I read it to my children when they were little. It's kind of a silly little story. Mr. Happy. On the other side of the world, where the sun shines hotter than here, and where the trees are 100 feet tall, there is a country called Happy Land. As you might very well expect, everybody who lives in Happy Land is as happy as the day is long. Wherever you go, you see smiling faces all around. It's such a happy place that even the flowers seem to smile in Happy Land. All the animals in Happy Land are happy as well. If you've never seen a smiling mouse or a happy cat or dog or even a smiling worm, go to Happy Land. This is a story about someone who lived in Happy Land, who happened to be called Mr. Happy. Mr. Happy was fat and round and happy. He lived in a small cottage beside a lake at the foot of a mountain and close to the woods. One day, while Mr. Happy was walking in those woods near his home, he came across something which was really very exciting. There in the trunk of one of the very tall trees was a door. Not a very large door, but it was certainly a door. A small, narrow, yellow door. Definitely a door. I wonder who lives here, thought Mr. Happy, and he turned the handle of that small, narrow, yellow door. The door wasn't locked, and it swung open quite easily. Just inside the small, narrow, yellow door was a small, narrow, winding staircase leading down. Mr. Happy squeezed his rather large body through the rather thin doorway and began to walk down the stairs. The stairs went round and round and down and round and down and down and round. Finally, after a long time, Mr. Happy reached the bottom of the staircase. He looked around and saw in front of him another small, narrow door, but this one was red. Mr. Happy knocked on the door. "Who's there?" said a voice. It was a sad, squeaky sort of voice. "Who is there?" Mr. Happy slowly pushed open the red door. There, sitting on a stool, was somebody who looked exactly like Mr. Happy, except that he didn't look happy at all. In fact, he looked downright miserable. So miserable would be another word for the opposite of happy. So sad or upset. "Hello," said Mr. Happy. "I'm Mr. Happy." "Oh, are you really?" sniffed the person who looked like Mr. Happy but wasn't. "Well, my name is Mr. Miserable, and I'm the most miserable person in the world." "Why are you so miserable?" asked Mr. Happy. "Because I am," replied Mr. Miserable. "How would you like to be happy like me?" asked Mr. Happy. "I'd give anything to be happy," said Mr. Miserable, "but I'm so miserable, I don't think I could ever be happy," he added miserably. Mr. Happy made up his mind quickly. "Follow me," he said. "Where to?" asked Mr. Miserable. "Don't argue," said Mr. Happy, and he went out through the small, narrow, red door. Mr. Miserable hesitated and then followed. Hesitated means to wait a little bit. Up and up the winding staircase they went, up and round and round and up and round and round and up until they came out into the woods. "Follow me," said Mr. Happy again, and they both walked through the woods back to Mr. Happy's cottage. Mr. Miserable stayed in Mr. Happy's cottage for quite a while, and during that time the most remarkable thing happened. Because he was living in Happy Land, Mr. Miserable very, very slowly stopped being miserable and started to be happy. His mouth stopped turning down at the corners. And very, very slowly, it started turning up at the corners. And eventually, Mr. Miserable did something that he had never done in his whole life. What do you think it is? He smiled. And then chuckled, which turned into a giggle, which became a laugh. A big, booming, hearty, huge, giant, large, enormous laugh. And Mr. Happy was so surprised that he started to laugh as well. And both of them laughed and laughed. They laughed until their sides hurt and their eyes watered. Mr. Miserable and Mr. Happy laughed and laughed and laughed and laughed. They went outside and still they laughed. And because they were laughing so much, everybody who saw them started laughing as well. Even the birds in the trees started to laugh at the thought of somebody called Mr. Miserable who just couldn't stop laughing. And that's really the end of the story, except to say that if you ever feel as miserable as Mr. Miserable used to feel, you know exactly what to do, don't you? Just turn your mouth up at the corners. Go on. So you can have somebody help make you laugh. Tell funny jokes. So there's lots of adjectives in this book. And so if we come back here, we see the words small, narrow, and yellow. And those are adjectives or describing words that tell us about the door. So you can tell somebody at home what the door looked like. It was small, narrow, and yellow. And those words can help you draw a picture to match what the door looked like. And then this one is described as small, narrow, but red. So you can go through the story again and listen for all those describing words. So we can describe this one as miserable, and this one is happy. Okay, I hope you enjoyed the story.